What you're about to hear is one man's account of his time with a group of Somali pirates as they waited trial in a Seychelles jail. Yes, I know, so many questions. How did he wind up there? What did he learn? And what can we learn about the people and the places that the system forsakes? That man is John Boyle, documentary and wildlife filmmaker who, if his life was a movie, I think I'd call it Boats, Bullets and Gunsmoke, because it's definitely not been short of adventure. So John is the author of a book and a film of the same name, Blood Ransom, Stories from the Front Line in the War Against Somali Piracy. He's now based in and works out of a small fishing village on the Cornish coast, not far from where I live. And when our paths crossed a few years back, we worked out we had a number of things in common. Obviously, we work in the same industry, but we had this really random mutual connection to Seychelles. My maternal grandmother comes from there, and obviously he'll tell you all about his connection with Seychelles in this episode. So you'll hear about that, but you'll also hear us talk a lot, as you might expect, about Somalia, including at least some of the reasons why the country was until recently considered a failed state. Now, this is an awful label. I really don't like it because it gives zero context. And to be perfectly frank with you, both John and I were talking about a country that neither of us have ever been to. But even a lazy internet search will tell you that Somali history did not begin in 1993 with Black Hawk Down. It has a long history of fierce resistance. A rich centuries-long history that dates back to the 13th century, at least that's recorded history, when it was the seat of the Ajuran Empire, a flourishing medieval kingdom. It's really worth looking at a map when you listen to this episode because it will help you understand that power in the Horn of Africa is all about control of water, access to fresh water and control of coastal ports, and therefore the trade routes across the Indian Ocean. The Ajurans mastered both. They built canals, dams, dikes, and levees that redirected water so that agriculture could flourish and cities like Mogadishu and Kismayo could thrive. And for almost 5 centuries, the Ajurans held off invasions from all directions, including Portuguese invaders from the east. And they did this all while trading gold and ivory and frankincense and no doubt slaves, sailing as far as China to trade with the Ming dynasty. Even when the Ajuran Sultanate declined in the 17th century, this tradition of fierce resistance continued as multiple foreign powers, including the Ethiopians, the French, and the British and Italians, tried to take hold of that region. The tide would eventually turn in 1920, when British forces launched one of their first colonial air offensives in Somaliland. They basically bombed the hell out of the Dervish forces in an air raid. And this was something that the resistance fighters, or insurgents, depending on your perspective, would never have seen before. And it's this perspective, this word perspective, that's going to come up a lot in this podcast, because I think this is how all of this fits into a podcast about system change. Storytelling and how history is recorded and how current affairs are reported determines how we see things, who the good guys are, who the bad guys are. And frankly, we should be asking, who gets to decide? So when I first asked John onto the podcast, he wasn't so sure he had the answers to any of these questions, but he said yes anyway. And thank God, because this turned out to be a really special conversation. When we got in touch and I saw the email that you pinged back, and it was like, I'm not clear how I fit into this brilliant bunch of scientists and experts. And you were like, I'm much more of a hands-on pragmatist. And to be honest, that's kind of why I want you on, because you've had a really, really interesting life. I don't know much about it, to be honest. You and I, our paths crossed in a really unusual way.
Yeah.
I can't actually even remember. I think I was doing a voiceover for a film of yours. And we realized there was a really, I just want everyone to imagine, I'm in a small beautiful fishing village on the coast of Cornwall. I go to meet a film producer to do a voiceover, and we get chatting, and it turns out that, yeah, we've got a lot in common in that John has filmed in Seychelles, knows a lot of people I know. We even talked about like the football stadium in Victoria, where a lot of concerts, a lot of like political rallies, a lot of stuff went on. So it's just weird for me because I sometimes feel like that part of my life is packed away. I always call myself the Kenyan Creole in Cornwall. And then all of a sudden I bump into John in a fishing village in Cornwall, and all of that, those memories and experiences and sights and sounds, and just kind of all come back to life. So it's pretty cool. It was really amazing, actually, having that connection where I really didn't expect it. So yeah, you've had a pretty amazing life. I know you sent us a kind of a Piracy, and it sounds like it's been a life of adventure. So I just wondered if you could talk about that.
I suppose that the most important thing for me has been the ocean, diving. And that's kind of where everything else has flowed from. So that's probably a good place to start. It's going to sound so boring. I was brought up in Oldham in Lancashire in the 1950s and 60s. But the truth is that, I was brought up in a mill town. My parents, they'd all come over from Ireland. They were mill workers and factory workers. We only ever saw the ocean if we went on a week's holiday to North Wales, and that was it. And when I was 17, I went on holiday with a school friend to Ireland, and I discovered the ocean, and I fell in love with it. And I ended up working on the boats. Do you know the Skellig Islands, where they filmed the Star Wars? Yeah. I ended up working on the boats, taking tourists out there. And those were the days when there was literally one boat going out there. Now there are about 50. And I was there last year. You've got people dressed as Wookiees going out to this sort of early Christian monastery on an island out in the Atlantic, because it was in Star Wars. But anyway, I fell in love with the ocean out there. And the guy who ran the boat was taking tourists out. And then he was fishing illegally for crayfish because you weren't allowed to dive for them. You could only catch them in nets or pots. And I borrowed his dive gear and taught myself how to dive when I was 17. And so everything sort of in my life seemed to flow from there. I'd gone to sort of a good school. I went to university. I hadn't got a clue what I wanted to do with myself. And I did 2 years in London training to be a lawyer in a city firm, commercial law, just another body in the city. And I've got to say that it wasn't me. It wasn't me at all. Mm-hmm. And so when I qualified, I decided, well, I didn't even know if I wanted to be a lawyer. I drew a line on a map, literally an old AA book we had in those days in 1980. And I thought, right, Devon and Cornwall's got good ocean. First job I get down there, I'll take. And I got a job in Helston. And it was to be a litigation lawyer, which in those days meant you did everything. You did divorces, personal injuries, sued people, crime, anything. And I'd never been in a court in my life, a criminal court. And the first week I was in Helston, I had to defend a case in the old Helston magistrates. And I'm not going to talk about being a lawyer, but I had an amazing, fun career. I just suddenly found something that I enjoyed doing, being an advocate, being a lawyer. But when I started making a little bit of money and had my own firm, I thought, right, now I can sort of start doing some proper dive traveling instead of just diving in cold water. And I bought myself a camera and a housing. I'd never, ever used a video camera, owned a video camera until then. This was 1988, I think, 1989. And I went to see a mate of mine in the Cayman Islands who was a lawyer as well. And to cut a long story short, I made a film. And at the time I thought, well, I might sell 100 copies on video through diving magazines and that'll be good. And while I was in the studio, I went to a studio in Penzance to edit it. I discovered there were these people called television sales agents, who you'll know about, who take basically independent broadcasters, independent producers' work and sell it to broadcasters around the world. Now, I'd never used a camera before. I had no background in television, but it just happened that I was lucky. High 8, which was the format I was using, was acceptable to broadcasters. For the first time ever, a consumer camera was acceptable to a broadcaster. So instead of having somebody like Cousteau with 20 guys, sort of cables running to the surface, lights that looked like football pitches, I could go down with my little camera and it was acceptable for a broadcaster. So the film I made was called K-Mania, and it was made like a surf movie, driving around the island in jeeps, playing local music, going diving, a few little MTV cuts, meant to be a bit of fun. And National Geographic bought it. And I mean, that's just astonishing for somebody who's never made a film, but National Geographic just took the... So I thought, whoa, this is interesting. So I tried to make a more serious film the next time at Cocos Island off Costa Rica. And Discovery bought it for the States. So I then ended up for a while with a dual career. I was enjoying being a lawyer, but I discovered this other world of traveling around the world, making films. And I ran the two for a few years, and then I sold my law firm. I probably made about a tenth of the money that I would have made as a lawyer, but what a life to have.
There are a lot of people that will be coming to this who either just love the industry, love the content, love the films, or are really desperate to get into the industry. And I mean, my story is nothing like yours, obviously, but there is a similarity in that I only ever sort of took the next best step. I didn't have like a long-term vision of where I wanted to be and how I was going to get there and what it was going to look like.
What I've done is a terrible business model, because you get commissioned, you know you're going to get paid to make a film. But if you make a film and you haven't even got an audience for it, then it's a bit of a gamble. But I've been lucky because I've used agents. They take my films. I usually come up with an idea. So I'm going to go to Papua New Guinea and make a film about crocodiles. And they'll say, no, it's not going to sell, or it might sell. And so I get a distribution agreement, which isn't worth the paper it's written on, because obviously if they don't make any sales, then I don't get anything. But it's meant that instead of having to go to endless meetings, and it's not easy, as you know, from Cornwall, trying to get up and down to London just to meet somebody for half an hour who might or might not be interested. I've just gone out and made my films, had the adventures, gone to the places. I've made something like 30 plus documentaries now, mainly wildlife, some about shipwrecks and one about Somali pirates. And they've sold. Some of them have sold extremely well. National Geographic still distributes some. ITV is distributing one at the moment. So yeah, some of them do well, some don't do quite as well. I was lucky. I had my background as a lawyer where I made a bit of money. I sold my practice and I could actually say, okay, I'll pay off my mortgage and I don't need to worry too much. You know, so I'd bring up my son, but he was pretty independent and I could go and do these things. So yeah, I mean, I've had lots of adventures along the way. You know, I've had somebody shot in front of me in Mexico. I've had guns pointed at me in the Lebanon, and all sorts of stories which I could go on about forever.
How did that affect you? Because, you know, when I'm been on location and are there to cover a wildlife story, but there's a people story that's happening that feels important. And that's kind of where you found yourself, I imagine, with the Somali pirates. So there are going to be people listening who will remember this as being very much in the news, sort of, I guess, what was that, late 90s into the early noughties? Just talk us through how this all started.
Well, what happened is that, two things started happening. Because there was no government, because there was no navy, no coast guard, foreign vessels started fishing in Somali waters.
When you say foreign, does anyone know which countries, what nations?
Everybody. It was a free-for-all. Because it's the Horn of Africa, such a rich ocean. Again, you know that ocean, how rich it is. Yeah. And I mean, the Taiwanese were particularly bad, but the Europeans were just as bad, lots of Asian countries. They would go in and instead of having to respect fishing limits, they'd literally be sort of going along the shore, trawling their nets, wrecking the reef, taking the fish. You had before that, you had a sort of basically sort of a survival fishing industry where, like you do in Cornwall, you know, you go out in your fishing boat and have your pots and bring in a few lobsters. Suddenly the fish were being hoovered up by these huge industrial trawlers. The fishing grounds were being destroyed by the techniques of trawling. So what the Somali fishermen did is they went out on their little boats and they tried to stop this happening. And they'd say to the big guys, look, you're wrecking our nets. You're doing all this. Give us some money. You're stealing our fish. And that is how it started. And to be honest with you, if I lived in a failed state and if Taiwanese fishing boats were fishing off Porthleven and taking away our livelihood, I'd have been out there with my little AK-47 as well. You know, I understand why they did it. The second thing that happened, and this is an astonishing story, but it's fully documented by the United Nations and lots of reports, is that the mafia and it was the mafia,
Okay.
the actual mafia.
Yeah.
Again, this is documented, and other sort of criminal organizations started dumping toxic waste off the coast of Somalia. Now, if you can imagine, in the European Union, there are regulations about how you dispose of toxic waste. It's got to be done in such a careful, controlled way. And you get paid a lot of money to do it because of that. But if you take Switzerland's toxic waste, put it on an old ship and scuttle it off the coast of Somalia, you're getting paid, I don't know how many thousands of dollars per tons, and you just dump it. And this actually happened, and it's documented. And it came to light when there was the Indonesian tsunami, and suddenly barrels of toxic waste were washing up on the beaches in Somalia. And kids were starting to be born with deformities and cancers because of what was happening. So effectively, the world was taking advantage of this failed state. And the Somalis reacted. And that's how it started. It went further. And then they would start boarding boats and holding them to ransom. At first, it was very, very small scale. But eventually, they were managing to go out and take a supertanker and get $25 million ransoms for it. And at that stage, organized crime in Somalia and elsewhere moved in. So it started out being kind of an innocent thing with local fishermen going out to protect their families, their catches, their ocean. And it became organized crime. And again, I know this because I've spoken to many Somali pirates, and they would talk about the company. They would say, okay, yeah, we get sent out to sea. I'd come from Mogadishu. I'd be given an AK-47. I'd be sent out to sea with these 10 guys I've never met before. We'd be told what to do. And then we had to sign for everything we took. And it was proper organized crime. So, yes, I had a lot of sympathy for it. And I still had a lot of sympathy for the poor people who've got no choice. But organized crime got behind it and was running it. And the boats these guys went out to sea on, there are little open boats in this harbour, which I wouldn't go outside Port Lebanon, and yet these guys were going out 300 miles out to sea. It's just an incredible feat of seamanship. They were going alongside these huge tankers that were plodding along at 10, 15 knots, getting little homemade ladders and clambering onto them. I'm not saying they were right, but what they were doing was driven by desperation, driven by poverty, driven by their backgrounds, and they became a scourge. A few hundred Somali fishermen became a scourge on the world's shipping for a long time. When I was writing the book and doing the film about them, we got access from a lot of different places. And one of them is we went on board one of the EU Naval Force boats, and I interviewed the commander on there. And the Somalis had mistaken his ship for a cargo ship and had actually attacked it. And there were bullet
While you were on
holes.
board?
Not while I was on board, but there were
Right.
bullet holes on this sort of, it was a Dutch warship, and the Somalis had actually, with their little AK-47s, attacked it to try and take it. And the commander said to me, and this is in the film, he said, we were 100 miles offshore, there were sort of 5-meter waves, and these guys were still coming at us. And he actually just kind of looked up and he said, it was an incredible feat of seamanship. And you could see almost the respect this man had for these guys. The more I looked into it, the more astonishing the story was, and I managed to look into it from all angles. We got access. I spent a week, in prison with the Somali pirates. I was allowed out at night, but literally I just go in Seychelles in the prison there.
Yeah, so explain that, because obviously you're a lawyer, you've been in Cornwall, you decide to strike out into the world, but how did that come about? Where did your sort of literal path cross with Somali pirates?
Okay, you're quite right. That seems strange that Seychelles was the epicenter of activity against them. But in fact, when you look at the map, you're right. It's offshore from Somalia. And there were even small fishing boats being taken from Seychelles. And in fact, one of the dive boats that I went to, Al Dabra, was taken. I knew the crew who were taken and the captain. But in fact, how I got the story was that through working with the Seychelles government, a friend of mine was the Seychelles ambassador to the UN and the Seychelles ambassador to the United States. And of all things, he actually put a post on Facebook saying, I've been out with our brave Seychelles Coast Guard hunting pirates. And I thought, wow, there's a story there. And so I contacted him, and because I knew him, knew the president, I got access and I made a film, which National Geographic distributed, about the pirates. And then out of the blue, I got an email from Bloomsbury saying, "We've seen your documentary. Would you like to write a book for us about Somali pirates?" And just one thing's led to another. And that was great, because that Blood Ransom sort of was in the bestsellers list for a while. It'd be great walking through an airport and you'd see your book on the bestsellers list next to Tony Blair's or Kim Kardashian's or something like that. Yeah. Maybe I shouldn't say this, but every time I walked through an airport and saw it there, suddenly it found itself as the bestseller, and somebody else had been moved down there. Just accidentally. I might have just moved it up there, and only once or twice. Yeah. And in fact, there was sort of it was Polish language versions, and it did all right. But again, it's the dream scenario. One thing leads to another. I never dreamt of writing a book about pirates, and I ended up being asked to.
So how many people, like how many men would have been out there? How many men would have made it back once they'd taken a ship? How many men were lost out to sea? Do we even know? How many men ended up in a Seychelles jail awaiting trial? And what happened to them since?
Well, there's some very interesting questions posed by that. Initially, we had all these international navies off there. We'd have sort of the EU naval force, the British Navy, the Indian Navy, the Dutch Navy. And if they captured a pirate, they would take them back to their own countries to put them on trial. And that very quickly became a problem, because let's say the pirates in Captain Phillips, if everyone's heard of Captain Phillips.
Film.
Yeah. I think they got something like 99 years in American prison. Whereas other countries like Holland would give somebody 4 years. And then those pirates would then be able to claim that it was too dangerous to go back. So they'd be able to claim residence in Holland. So you had this bizarre sort of spread. And eventually what was decided was that they would focus their attentions on Seychelles. They would build the courts there. I'm talking about the EU and everybody else. They'd put money into building the court system there. They built a new jail on the hilltop there so they could actually focus and take them in there. Kenya was another country which was doing the same thing. So it saved all this sort of problem of different countries having different rules, different laws, different penalties. So Seychelles became the focal point for detaining the pirates, prosecuting them and imprisoning them and doing what had to be done. So there's this new hilltop prison built there. You obviously gun towers and wires all around. But in fact, the Somalis didn't want to escape, because they were far better off there. They were far better fed. They had everything they could possibly want. They weren't going to escape into Seychelles, because what could they do there? They'd be obvious they were Somalis, and it was simple as that. So it was an incredibly relaxed atmosphere, and all the governor would do is every morning I'd turn up at the prison. They'd let me in through the gate, let me into the yard. I had a translator, and I'd just spend the day chatting to the Somalis. And the first day, a small little Somali guy came up and was the only one who'd speak to me. And he was basically sounding me out. And he said, "Are you Interpol? Are you CIA? Are you?" And we had a chat and we got to know each other. And he obviously reported back. And then in the afternoon, there was a queue of them all wanted to talk to me. And from then on, I just I'd had to bring in cigarettes and things for them, sort of legally. But, one of them wanted a book. And so I bought him, he wanted to learn English. So I bought him a child's book about piracy, and he loved it,
Wow.
One of the funniest things is that one of the things they asked me was, had I seen Captain Phillips? And I said, yeah. And they said, "Isn't it a good film? It's really good, isn't it? Yeah, we've got it on DVD here. We watch it all the time. We think it's a great film."
Wow. God, that's mad, isn't it? Life imitating art, imitating life. I don't even know anymore. God, that's crazy. So I read your book when we sort of soon after we met. I was like, well, partly because there was that connection with Seychelles.
That connection,
partly because it's pirates. I hate to say, I mean, obviously some of the stories you shared, you're like, okay, it's not just a bit of fun at all, but there is something about pirates and the high seas that everyone finds captivating. So I read your book. It was definitely a page turner. The faces, though, because you've got like the center spread of like some photos of some of the men that you interviewed, some of the people you got to know. Are you in touch with any of them still?
It was very much like a journalistic job. There was no way I would have or could have or would have bonded with them enough to want to stay in contact. So no, I don't know their stories. I don't know what happened afterwards.
You don't
It'd
know
be interesting
what
to know.
sentences they served or anything like that. Would they have served the sentences in Seychelles?
Yes, yes. I think there was a stage when they were actually trying to build a prison back in Somalia, and the story's probably evolved since then. But the problem is, I don't think it was felt to be particularly secure at the time. The ultimate idea of dealing with Somali piracy was to deal with the internal issues in Somalia. If you had a stable government, if you had a rule of law, then obviously the problems would be dealt with and would go away. So I think that the solution, the short term, was like, let's send the Navy, let's deal with this problem. But the longer term solution, and the only solution, whether it's Somalia or Yemen or anything else, is you've got to have a stable government, you've got to have a stable country. And if you have that, then people shouldn't be driven to piracy, and their fishing will be protected, and organised crime won't be ruling the country. So that was the ultimate aim. And
I know, I see what you're saying. I mean, for me, like, one of the images that really stood out, because there's been a more recent, like, it's a half-hour, probably self-funded film looking back at the story. So it's on YouTube, and it's called Somali Pirates, Good Guys or Bad Guys. And in that film, there's an image of all the shipping that passes through the Gulf of Aden and rounds the Horn of Africa. And I couldn't believe it's like just, and like specks, it looks like ants on the map, a trail of ants going past. And it made me think of, it'd be like being in one of those sushi restaurants with a conveyor belt of like endless, beautiful food going past, and you got no money, and you're really, really pissed off. And you got big balls as well, I might add. And it's like, of course that's going to happen. So for me, it's I don't know, it sort of screams like kind of inequality on the global scale. And so for me, that's like, I don't know what to do about that, obviously, because otherwise I wouldn't be doing a podcast. I'd be in charge of the world. But there's something there for me. You know, it's like, it's inequality. That's kind of the real issue. I know this is sort of taking us away a little bit from that boots on the ground pirate story, but I don't know what your take is on all of that, the inequality side of it.
yeah, well, I mean, you look at Yemen at the moment. The only thing we know about Yemen is that occasionally England and the United States, or Britain, the United States, bomb Houthi rebels there. But Yemen, for at least a decade, has just been, it's a bit like Somalia was, appalling starvation. Have you ever seen a newscast about Yemen? Never. It's not newsworthy. It's much more interesting about what some influencer has done, or if you look at the sort of 10 most read BBC news items every day, you know, that some of them are so trivial, so trite, sort of, you know, Prince Andrew walked in front of somebody at an event or something like that. Nobody seems to care. That's what I said, nobody seems to care. Yeah, okay, millions of people are dying in Yemen, but does it affect me? I don't know. It just makes me feel somehow that the world was probably a better place. It's too general, because obviously people do care. We all care about certain things, about people, about the environment. But things like that, that sort of suffering is kind of just, oh, well, what the hell? Sort of, it's Yemen, don't even know where it is on a map, so what's it matter to me?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, my take on it is what you say, that it's not, for whatever reason, newsworthy. And I don't know which, you know, is it a chicken and egg? Is it not newsworthy because people don't care? Or is it that people don't care because they don't see it on the news, so they don't know to care?
Probably the latter as much, yeah.
Right, yeah. But in terms of what you've learned, I guess, because a lot of the places that you've traveled to and filmed in and worked in, so Cuba, Papua New Guinea, like, it's amazing, like the places you've been to. But also places where there are these extremes. Are there countries in the world that the model of, you know, a successful government and a democracy as we know it, or we think we know it anyway, are there countries in the world where that simply just isn't going to fly ever?
I'm sort of quite controversial, I think, because you talk about Cuba. I have a massive respect for Cuba. I think it's an amazing country. I think because there was a crisis in the 1960s and they allowed the Russians to point missiles from there forever, the big bully, which is the United States, has just bullied them for the last 60 years and caused so much poverty in the country. Whereas they were just sort of stuck two fingers up the United States 50 years ago and are still being punished for it. So you go somewhere like Cuba and it's got a lot of soul. I mean, incredible. Havana's just an amazing, crumbling city, although it's being restored a bit now. I think the reason I've been to these countries isn't because they were in the state they were. It was more that they were the places where you could still find untouched wildlife, an incredible natural phenomenon. Because they've not evolved. I mean, Papua New Guinea is the most intriguing country on the planet. They've got about, I don't know how many different languages. You'll have literally, there'll be a village, if you live in Falmouth, across the river at St. Maur's, they talk a different language, as simple as that. They've even
completely got different, not just a dialect.
Yes, they've even got different counting systems. I think one of them, instead of being based on 10, is based on 23, which is 10 fingers, 10 toes, your nose, your chin, and something else. It's just an incredible country. So it's more I've gone there because of the incredible wildlife, because it's untouched, and there are less and less places in the world like that. The story in Cuba, I'm digressing a bit, but the film we made there was called Castro's Secret Reef. And what happened is that obviously the Cubans were always trying to get to Miami to escape from Castro, to meet up, go to the States. And what they found is that if they gave fishing boats enough fuel to fish on this outer reef, which is a long reef, it's about 60 miles long, it's called the Garden of the Queens. If they gave them enough to go out there to fish for a week and come back, they had enough fuel to go to Miami, and so the fishing boats were just disappearing. So for almost 50 years, this became a no-go area. So nobody fished there. So while the rest of the Caribbean was devout with holiday resorts, overfished, polluted, you had this incredible pristine reef which nobody was allowed to go to. And the only person who went there was Castro, who used to go diving there. It was his private diving place. Wow. So you go there and it's still got sort of crocodiles, these gorgeous little hootiers. You've got sort of massive fish life. It's a kind of mangroves and sort of coral keys. So yeah, the reason I've gone to these places is because they've still had that incredible wildlife. And Papua New Guinea is just still, they're still even discovering new species there. It's just incredible.
It is incredible. In fact, I remember, actually, do you know what? There's one of the things that is I'm starting to realize, because I'm getting on, is there's a lot
70
of
this year.
References. Well, there's some references, and I think younger listeners may not know who Fidel Castro is. So for our younger listeners,
you can't be serious.
Well, I don't know, but I'm just thinking I was asking someone about the Big Lebowski the other day. They didn't know what I was talking about. So, seriously though, I think it is worth it because, and also kind of your take on who, like Fidel Castro. I'm curious now because the way you just talked about Cuba surprised me a bit. So I'd be interested to know how would you describe him?
I can't speak from any personal knowledge. It's only the same knowledge that everybody's got from history, from the press. But Cuba was an incredibly corrupt country under Batista.
So that's the 1950s, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Castro was one of those sort of South American revolutionaries who came and sort of got rid of the corrupt Western American government. I'm sure he did a lot of bad stuff, and he was a dictator. But which was worse, the corrupt dictator that went before or the sort of perhaps more socialist dictator who came afterwards? Cuba made its money out of its sugarcane, and of course America just cut them right off from that, drove them into the arms of Russia, who in those days was trying to expand and get, as it still does, in Africa and particularly in Central America. And that's why the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. I probably have a sort of it's a bit like the bandits in the Western films or something. You have kind of sneaking respect for people who, like Castro, can actually go ashore with just a few supporters and literally just a handful of men and take over a country and kick out a Western dictatorship. I kind of still have a sneaking respect for that. Although, as I say, I'm sure he did a lot of bad stuff as well.
Surely it is possible for us to start practicing, like I say us, I mean just like generally humanity, because back in my mode of, well, if I rule the world, what would I do? I would make it a daily practice that we try and hold two truths at the same time, which is it was admirable, maybe, and the way that you describe was admirable that he tried to take back his country from a lot of corruption and exploitation, but he also did a lot of bad things. Both are true. Can we hold that at the same time? Because I sort of feel like this is one of the things I find so frustrating is that need for good guys and bad guys. And you can't have, like at the moment, I'm like, are there any good guys out there? I mean, similarly, like, just going back to Somali pirates or even now more recently, I was reading about the same kind of situation in Nigeria, in the Niger Delta, where there's like really hardcore like piracy of oil shipping. And again, like, I don't think I'd be safe with any of those men. I really don't. I think they're dysfunctional when compared to the societal norms that I'm used to, and aren't afraid of violence, either being done to them or doing it themselves. But at the same time, I have that feeling of like, well, the way they describe it is everyone's coming there to make money and no one's hiring them, or that feeling of like that conveyor belt of riches going past them all the time. Not just that, but the land, the country, the water that they live in, that they've come from, their ancestors are buried there, is being poisoned. And so there's a part of me that's like, yeah, actually, fuck it. They have a right to try and do what they can because no one else is doing it for them. Sorry, I've just gone off on one there, but I sort of feel like that good guy, bad guy thing. It's not a helpful narrative in the real world, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, there are two things that arise from that. I mean, I don't want to get into politics too much, but Russia invades Ukraine. They're the bad guys. Israel invades Gaza. Gaza are the bad guys. And it's kind of, it's like I said, it's taking sides, and people tend to take sides. I think I've had a slightly different, or an ability to look at things differently, possibly from what I was talking about earlier, my history as a criminal lawyer, because during the time I represented several murderers. I dealt with what at the time were the two biggest ever drugs importations into the UK, although they've been much bigger since then. And instead of having the sort of Daily Mail, Daily Telegraph, shock horror, or the people watching television, you actually got to know that these people were actually human beings as well, and you would be talking to them, and I was never quite as judgmental, I think, as many people are. Everybody's got a story, and everybody needed an advocate to say that story for them. And I think it's sort of like with the Somali pirates. To most people, they were just evil. Yeah. And of course, if you are taking somebody's... relatively few people were ever hurt by them. And I remember reading a book by a middle-class British couple who'd been taken by the pirates for a while when they were sailing on their yacht along the coast there.
I remember that, yeah.
But they complained in the book they were treated so badly because the only thing they were given to eat was cold spaghetti out of a carrier bag. Now, isn't that awful? The hell did they think the Somalis were eating? Steaks? It was that sort of Western attitude. The Somalis were giving them what they were eating, but these people thought it was horrific because that's all they gave us to eat. So, you can be judgmental about things. Yeah. And I just found that perhaps I've always, maybe from being a lawyer and having to see both sides of something, I can look at something like Somalia or Cuba and perhaps have a different take to the establishment take on it, if we put it that way.
Yeah. So talking about trials and good guys and bad guys, one of the things that I find really astonishing, and you might be able to shed some light on, is that a lot of column inches and airtime has been given to the issue of Somali piracy. And I can understand why, for all the reasons that we've discussed. But one of the things I haven't seen much about is, has there been any, to the countries, the people, the entities, the criminal gangs that actually did the dumping of the toxic waste in the first place? What happened with that? Literally radioactive barrels of waste washing up on the Somali coastline. Did anyone get done in for that?
The only person I know who ever suffered for it was a journalist who was investigating it who was killed.
Wow.
Nobody has ever been prosecuted for that, as far as I'm aware. I think it's just too difficult to prove. So you somewhere
Too
off
difficult,
Somalia,
too dangerous.
too dangerous as well. But yeah, so
Yeah.
an old ship sinks off Somalia. It was sort of registered in Liberia. It's got a Indonesian crew with a Sri Lankan master, and it's not even insured, and it disappears. I mean, how do you prosecute somebody? I'm not aware of any prosecutions, but I am aware of a United Nations investigation, which definitely found that was happening, and could even trace the barrels washed up on the shore in Somalia back to, I think this was particularly Swiss medical waste, I think, on that particular occasion. But yeah,
yeah.
it's fact, yeah.
Okay. Wow.
It's been cheerful, hasn't it?
We've all woken up to the idea of how we spend our money can be our loudest vote. But what about where we keep our money, who we bank with? According to the Consumer Association, UK high street banks are amongst the worst culprits when it comes to financing fossil fuels, arms companies, and frankly, all the stuff we don't think about when we think about positive change. So Triodos Bank has been blazing a trail for the financial sector in ethical and sustainable banking for over 40 years. They're top rated by Ethical Consumer Magazine. They've been named Best Ethical Financial Provider at the British Bank Awards. They're B Corp certified. And they are 2023's Charities Bank of the Year. They're doing really good stuff. Their aim is simple: to be a safe and secure bank for your money while being totally transparent with what they do with your money. So no lending or investing in fossil fuel projects, and focusing instead on renewable energy, nature regeneration, and community-based projects. I honestly couldn't be happier or prouder to have them as a sponsor for If I Rule the World. I want you to suspend your disbelief for a moment. I want you to assume everyone wants you where you are. They voted you in. You rule the world. Don't worry about the how. You've got a great team, all around you. Mm-hmm. But you are ruler of the world. What would be the first thing you tackle and why?
I had a bit of a think about this. And I think that at the moment, the world population is just exploding exponentially. It's just going crazy. And we're not going to survive. It's as simple as that. So I think if I was the dictator of the world, I'd take the Chinese model and I'd say each couple could only have one child. Mm-hmm. And in a generation, you'd actually bring that growth of the population into check. And I know there's lots of issues arise from that, but I think we can't just dream on and sit here and drift and think everything's going to be wonderful. So I think you have to do something really radical like that. I've got two more policies. The second one is that I would simply ban all private motor vehicles, full stop. It'd have so many implications. You've got obviously the pollution aspect of it. Mm-hmm. You've got what vehicles are doing to the planet. We've got to have more roads, more parking spaces. You've got the fact we're building vehicles, which are digging up raw materials. We're transporting them around the world. We're transporting oil. Instead, we could have such an enhanced system of public transport. It's an extreme thing to say, but if we didn't have cars, you would have to live in your community like we used to do before. And It's not all hardship, because we've also got remote working, we've got computers, so it's not like we're going to go back to Victorian times. It'd be a good balance. And you'd still be able to travel. There'd be enhanced public transport.
So human connection, I think, is what I'm hearing. Sort of more than community. It's actually just kind of going back into a world where most of our relationships are face-to-face, eyeballing people, basically. Do you think that's what it is?
Have you watched that We're the World documentary? I watched that last night, and if you watch anything, I'd watch it. And It suddenly made me realize that people used to care, and people don't seem to care as much at the moment. We've got a world in a real mess. I'm not going to go into politics, but we've got Gaza, we've got the Ukraine, we've got the awful things happening in Yemen you don't even hear about, all the starvation.
True.
We've got Africa, you can list countries,
DRC,
failed states.
Sudan.
And people used to actually care. People used to make records and have collections and do things for it. And now it's almost that we've got this fatalistic feeling that We can't do anything about it. We're going to have another Donald Trump in the States. Our government are useless. Can't do anything about it. I don't know. I just got this vibe from that film that, people don't care as much these days.
Well, it's an interesting one because there's perception versus reality. I think there's it feels like a compassion deficit at the moment. Actually, there was a brilliant thing I heard. Okay, so it was another podcast, a Chris Williamson podcast, and he was just talking about like an out of office message, automatic reply that he got. And it said, sorry, I haven't replied to your email. I'm just busy trying to absorb all the world's news in one go with a brain that was designed to forage peanuts or something. And I thought, yeah, shit, that's there's a lot there to unpack. But I do think neither of us are necessarily well placed to kind of go, well, why is it that it seems like no one cares? Why do we think, is that true? I don't know, but it's definitely a perception. And I don't think you or I alone in feeling like that.
No, but you've got to have my number 3 policy as well.
Oh, God, wow. You're really going for this. I love it because most people only get one. Okay.
Oh, no, this is my third one. This is perhaps the most important. Any music made after 1990 should be banned because there hasn't been any good music made since 1990, apart from Amy Winehouse, yes. But
there will be revolution.
I wouldn't allow it to be played, so I probably wouldn't last very long.
Up.
they'll give up their cars, but they won't give up their music.
No, that's
anyway.
That's where it all descends into anarchy, and I'll regret having ever asked the question. But thanks, John. One of the things you said right at the beginning, and I was going, oh gosh, I'm not sure this is going to go very well because you talk about population, and it's like one of my bugbears because I sort of feel like that's a story that needs updating in terms of like perception versus what's actually happening in terms of data. And there's a kind of a tipping point at the moment where a lot of policies, a lot of perception in terms of where we are with human population growth is still at there's far too many of us and we got to do something about it. But it's actually another podcast episode. I really, really want to get this guy on, Max Rosa, who it's a website called Our World and Data. It became really popular, very well used by all kinds of journalists and commentators and politicians during COVID because they were tracking so much data on that. But they do all stuff. It's literally Our World in Data. And he was collating all the information about human population growth and where we are. And in absolute terms, numbers are going to go up, but they'll probably level out at about 9 billion by the end of this century, I believe. But the projections are that it is going, in absolute terms, human population is already going to drop. And even in countries where, like Chad, for example, which have really high birth rates, those are already starting to come down. And what I found really interesting, and you've mentioned Yemen a lot, was in countries where high birth rates are still really high, but they're starting to come down. That's not because of any kind of public policy or any kind of intervention. The single biggest thing that changes human population and how many babies women have isn't education, isn't all the things that we think about. It's actually infant mortality. So in countries where infant mortality is really high, so Yemen, Afghanistan, DRC, so all these geopolitical hotspots where, just to get, I guess I'm a bit of a heavy person, but just to kind of call it what it is, it's babies dying, That is why women continue to have babies. So there's a part of me that's like, I'm just desperate to get him on this podcast. And if he's listening, please, I need you. Because I really want an expert to be able to explain this to me and therefore listeners. Because as far as I understand it, addressing infant mortality is the single most effective way of addressing human population growth. And so for me, that's a really compassionate way to come at it. And so there's a kind of sense for me is like, I don't know, am I on a crusade? No, but I feel like it's an important message to get out there. But actually, John, thank you. It's really interesting to hear the way you've come at all these big political stories, all these environmental stories, all these human stories from such a different background, different kind of journey. But I feel like we're kind of roughly in the same place on a lot of things.
I was thinking that as well as we've gone along. Yeah. I mean, I just have a certain view, which isn't sort of perhaps as popularly held, as commonly held. But I do think that traveling, I know it's a cliche, traveling broadens your mind.
So, wow, we've covered a lot of ground. I just wanted to ask you about like the things that you're working on at the moment, what the future holds, what keeps John getting up every morning.
I'm working on a 3-part series of documentaries, and it's called Remains of War. If you go around Europe, there's virtually no trace of the Second World War left now, is there? But if you go around the islands of the Pacific, it's everywhere. You go underwater, there are literally sunken fleets, submarines, planes. You go in the jungle, there's a crashed plane, a tank, a Japanese sort of tunnel complex where they had 10,000 men. It's phenomenal, and it's still all there. So I've been filming for the past 3 or 4 years now, going out there to different locations. I've been to Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, Palau, Truk Lagoon, all these places where they've got intense debris of war. And so it's a new approach to telling a story that's been told so many times. Another thing which I really enjoy doing is I've got a boat and I like to use it. And it's a motorboat, but I've taken it to Morocco, I've taken it to the Arctic Circle, I've taken it to St. Petersburg. And this year my idea is to actually go just up the Irish Sea, round all the islands, up to the Shetlands, the Orkneys, and then to St. Kilda. And that's my kind of project. I do that for a magazine. I produce articles for them and videos. But the passion in my life is that about 5 years ago, I bought 6 acres of land up on the West Penwith Moors. You probably know the back road from Penzance to St. Ives.
Yeah.
Nan Cledra, the engine in there. It's in that area. And I've planted about 1,700 trees up there. I'm trying to rewild it. We've dug a couple of ponds. I've got a little shepherd's hut there and a composting toilet we've dug. And I just spend most of my time up there. I've got a couple of little camera traps. We've got badgers, foxes, deer up there. Great bird wildlife. There's a couple of resident buzzards. Some pheasants have moved in recently. And that's these days my passion. And that really is my joy. When we finish this podcast, I'm up there to sort of clear some of the trees and trim back some brambles. And so, yeah, that's where I'm going at the moment. That's me.
And that's John Boyle. I can say it now. He was a total wildcard guest on this podcast. I knew he had great stories, but I had no idea how it was going to play out, whether we'd actually even see eye to eye. And to be honest, I think I get the sense that John wasn't so sure himself when we first got going. And I'm going to throw us both under the bus right now, because I found it surprising that an old white guy and a slightly less old black woman actually ended up finding quite a lot of common ground. Maybe just not on the music front. But this is more than whether John and I agree on everything or not. Clearly, that's not going to happen with anyone. And maybe that need to surround ourselves with people who we agree on all counts, where we can agree who the good guys are and who the bad guys are, isn't helpful. And I suspect the need for good guys and bad guys is even less helpful. And obviously, I know I'm sounding very gender specific here, but I mean people. I mean, because when we step away from all these stories, whether it's conflicts and geopolitics or even in our own relationships, the reality is there is no good or bad. They're just people fucking up to varying degrees. At the end of the day, though, maybe the thing I really appreciated about what John had to say was his attitude towards people and their stories. When he said everybody's got a story and everyone needs an advocate to tell that story for them. You can find John's film and book, Blood Ransom, via the links in the show notes, as well as links to a few more articles and films mentioned in this episode. I can't tell you how much I enjoy being able to share these conversations and how together, you, the audience, me, our guests, we can all keep joining the dots to positive change. On that note, get in touch with your comments and insights, as well as questions and even suggestions for future guests. Email is podcast@julianburkevoice.com. I appreciate every single listener, every single listen, every follow, every like. But if there's one thing I'd love you to do more than all of that, if you want to help the podcast grow, please share it, even with just one person. Anyone who you think will get a real kick out of these conversations. For now, though, Take a moment, take a breather, and ask yourself, if I ruled the world, what would I do? Thank you for listening.